I'm Leon Charney, and this is the Leon Charney Report, and I'm coming to you live from Israel. It's a Thursday, and it's a very hectic time in this country, as I said to you last week. Let's talk about some of the issues that we have been trying to analyze and summarize here. A, is Bibi Netanyahu really in control of his government? B, has he isolated the Israeli government from many of the Arab nations today? C, what will President Clinton do if he wins his second term and he does not have to run for re-election? Will he be more stern with the Israeli government? These are questions that are running around this country in a very rampant way. On the agenda today and this morning is the fact that the relationship between Jordan and the Netanyahu government is really sour. The king has made some very tough and stern statements against Netanyahu, and what's crucial about this is that Netanyahu was leaning on the king as his real strong friend in the Arab world since he had some problems with Mubarak and obviously some problems with Yasser Arafat. So the people in Israel are very uptight about the situation in Jordan today. Maybe it will dissolve, maybe it won't. Another interesting thing that happened this week was that, I'm sure you saw it in the newspapers or saw it on television, is that Yasser Arafat came to Caesarea, Israel, to visit the house of Ezer Weitzman, the president of Israel, and they had a very good session, and they all, each of them, rather, had good words to say about one another. The question is, how strong is the presidency here, and can it influence the policy in the state? There are some objections to Weitzman getting outside of the ceremonial aspects of being a president and getting into the political arena. I would say the majority of people, though, are very pro-Weitzman and suggest that he's doing a very important role. He's also on his way next Monday to visit President Mubarak. I believe it'll be a state visit there for one day. And as I understand it, King Hussein is also going to invite him to go to Jordan. So he's sort of become the roving diplomat to make sure that the relationships are not soured. Economically in the country, things are not doing that great. When there is strife, obviously, people don't want to invest in the country. And the stock market shows that. The tourism industry is down. The agricultural industry is down. A lot of things are turning a bit sour. On the other hand, it's unfair to judge Bibi Netanyahu. It's only about 110 days that he's been in office, and it's very tough to criticize someone who takes over a country like Israel and expects him to do miracles in 100 days. One of the most interesting things that I have seen in my vast interviews this week, and I have interviewed Ehud Barak, who's the leading candidate to be the leading candidate to be the Labour Party's prime minister candidate. He was the former chief of staff, and he was once the chief of Sayeret Matkal, or the head of the Sayeret Matkal, which is the commando unit in which Bibi Netanyahu was his soldier. So that's a fascinating interview. Also, we'll go into depth and show you what the new law has meant to the country, which means that the Prime Minister now has a lock on his elections for the next 4 years, unless 61 members of the Knesset decide to have a tremendous profile of courage and leave their seats, and everyone goes back and tries to win an election again. Not very likely. In the meantime, today we will show you a broadcast or rebroadcast of a fascinating interview we did with Bill Gates, the former CIA director, who in that interview claims that the collapse of the Soviet Union came not from the hands of Ronald Reagan, but the hands of Jimmy Carter. Enjoy the show. We'll see you next week back in the studio.
The Jewish National Fund creates hundreds of thousands of housing sites, making possible the historic return of the Russian and Ethiopian Jews to their promised land. You can help fulfill the promise.
Hi, I'm Leon Charney, and this is the Leon Charney Report, and I have just read a fascinating book. If you really want to understand what went on in the United States between Russia, the Soviet Union, The whole world, you got to read this book. It is called From the Shadows, and I don't recommend books that often. I did recommend a few, but I'd say that this one really gives you the history of America behind the scenes that you will not get from any other book that I've read. And I've been through part of this action, so to speak, with a man called Robert Gates, the former CIA director, who served 5 presidents, 11 secretaries of state, and God knows how many national security people. Bob, it's an honor to have you on the show, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
I couldn't put the book down. It was tremendous. I mean, you worked for 5 presidents, and you diagnosed them in a sense. It's impeccable. Now, I had a lot to do with Jimmy Carter, so the first thing I want to do is tell me what you thought of Jimmy Carter.
I found that he was personally the least approachable, other than Nixon. I didn't really know Nixon very well, but of those that I knew reasonably well, I found Carter to be the most difficult to get to know and the most distant. But I also thought that he was the smartest president that I worked for, and he was probably the hardest working president that I worked for.
A little penurious, though, wasn't he?
He was, actually, I make the point, he was the tightest-fisted president with a dollar, with the taxpayer's dollar, of any of the ones that I worked for, whether it was defense or domestic affairs. I saw occasions when his Secretary of State, his Secretary of Defense, his head of CIA, and his National Security Advisor would all come into him with a recommendation to spend $5 or $10 million on something, and he would say no, because it was too much money. He was very fiscally conservative.
He still is, by the way. I think he goes, if he can, he goes tourist class when he flies. He's unbelievable. But you sort of revisit his foreign policy. You give him a lot more credit than the public has given him, especially with the Soviet Union. You talk about he understood what was going on in Afghanistan way before, and he supported some rebels there. He did some work in South America. I mean, a lot of people don't notice about Jimmy Carter.
This is a whole element of President Carter's foreign policy that has remained secret up until this book, and partly it's because the people who were involved in the Carter administration wrote their memoirs a long time ago, long before there was any willingness to make many of these things public. And so my timing helps in that respect because there's some distance. But the bottom line is that he pursued policies toward the Soviet Union, both overtly and covertly, that were much tougher than appeared to be the case at the time. Just to use the examples that you were referring to, he began authorizing covert actions against the Soviet Union as early as March 1977. Within 2 months after he took office, he authorized a considerable increase in CIA's program to smuggle into the Soviet Union literature, books, periodicals, video cassettes, and so on, bringing the words of Soviet dissidents to the Soviet people, as well as information about the misdeeds of their government, about their national culture, and particularly for the minority ethnic groups, and the literature about democracy. And even in the Third World, as early as 1978, he was formulating strategies to try and deal with Soviet aggression in the Third World. Ironically, in 1978, he was blocked by CIA and the State Department that didn't want to get involved in covert
Stansfield
action.
Turner was it was his head of the CIA.
That's correct. And then by 1979, by early 1979, Carter was really underway. And even before the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, with President Carter's authorization, CIA was undertaking covert actions to counter the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, to help the government in El Salvador resist the infiltration of Sandinista weapons. And 6 months before the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, Carter was authorizing covert assistance to the Mujahideen. So there's a record there of actions on the secret side and the shadow wars, if you will, that really has remained secret up until this time.
Where were you during the Iran hostage crisis?
I was I left the White House within a couple of months of that to go back to CIA. I served from early in 1977 until the end of 1979 as
National Security.
Dr. Brzezinski's assistant.
Maybe you can answer this, since I worked on Camp David. Have you ever seen a president take 13 days of his presidency and go to Camp David and try and make an agreement between two countries and then travel to the Middle East as he did at the final leg and go to Jerusalem and then Cairo and do this Herculean job? A, what compelled him to do it? And B, have you ever seen anything in history, or have you read anything in history like this?
No, I haven't, and I don't think there's any precedent for it. The only thing even remotely comparable to it was President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's mediation of the Russo-Japanese War back in 1905, for which he got the Nobel Prize, by the way.
Jimmy hasn't got one.
He hasn't got his yet. But I think people can understand or grasp the commitment of time and so on. I think what may have eluded people was the incredible amount of political risk that he took. The odds were so much against that agreement, and to make that kind of commitment of American and presidential prestige to a process where the outcome was so uncertain, very few presidents are willing to take that kind of a risk.
We didn't know each other then, but you were probably in a King David Hotel in Jerusalem, sitting with the President and Dr. Brzezinski and the Secretary of State Vance, and then Carter made a decision to stay another 24 hours. Do you remember that?
Yes.
All the wheels started to move.
And then we had to land at Cairo Airport on our way home to finalize
the deal. It's an amazing story. We lived through it. Mr. Nixon, what was your opinion of Mr. Nixon?
Well, I think that I characterize the period of détente in the book as the era of smoke and mirrors. And the reason is that while the rhetoric was of building a new relationship with the Soviet Union, of building an enduring peace and so on, in fact, during that period, neither side ever missed a single opportunity to try and extract a unilateral advantage from the other. Neither side ever gave up a single strategic offensive weapon. The reality is that the adversarial, confrontational nature of the relationship continued, even though after 1972 both Nixon and Henry Kissinger tried to minimize that. There were some benefits from détente, some very important benefits. One was the agreement on Berlin that essentially eliminated the city as a flashpoint in the Cold War for the rest of the Cold War. Another was the process, the dialogue involved in the arms control negotiations on nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy, a process, a dialogue that I think became much more important than the agreements that resulted from it, at least on the offensive side. And finally, détente opened up the Soviet Union to a flow of officials, journalists, scientists, cultural groups, and finally tourists that began to erode Soviet information control. So I think there were some real benefits to détente, but I also think that it was mischaracterized at the time, and that was the reason the disillusionment with it set in 1974, 75, and 76.
And on a personal level, you say that Nixon was sort of a soft guy on the inside and a tough guy on the outside?
Well, this is a guy, and I draw the contrast with President Carter. Nixon, as so many books have described, absolutely dreaded personal confrontation or saying negative things to people or whatever. And one of the reasons that his White House door was so guarded was because he was always afraid of being put in a position where he'd have to say something like that or confront or be confronted by somebody. In contrast, President Carter, who appeared so soft on the outside, was iron-willed, and unlike any president that I witnessed and worked for, he was more than willing to criticize and to dress down his most senior associates, even at the cabinet level. I mean, he did not shrink from that kind of confrontation and personal encounter.
I'll tell you a story, and I agree with you. We were at a White House reception, and this was for the Jewish celebration of Israel or something. There were 500 people in the White House, and Carter sent a Marine to talk to me because he wanted me to convey a message to Ezer Weitzman, who was then Defense Secretary, about Lebanon. And the Marine came to me and said, "Mr. Charney, the President would like to see you." I said, "Yes, sir." And I walked over, and then there was another high official, I won't name him, he said, "Mr. President, would you like me to come with you?" And he, those blue eyes, remember those blue staring, when he gave you those blue eyes, he just said no. And that was the end of this guy. He disappeared. So, and he put his arm around me and he said, I just want to tell you that I appreciate what you're doing. And to get affection, in a sense, from Carter, you really had to earn it. I mean, he just wouldn't give it. To get any, he was penurious even in his praise unless you really deserved it. The guy was a truthful man. He just, he wasn't going to give you a lot of baloney. But I agree with you. If you saw those eyes, those blue eyes came right out of his sockets, and that was the end of you. You were finished. We got a cut for a commercial break. We'll come right back with Robert Gates, the former CIA director, who's written a book called From the Shadows. My prediction is it will be a bestseller. Everybody has to read this book if you want to see the history of the United States through the eyes of a man who saw it for the past 25 years. We'll be right back. We're back with Robert Gates, the former CIA director, who's written an intriguing and compulsive book. You must read it. It's called From the Shadows, and I read it last night. Stayed up all night. That's why I look a little weary today. You come up with some wonderful remarks about President Ford. You think he was understated and not as revered as he should have been.
That's correct. I think that he is considerably underestimated. Here's a president that people portrayed as not being terribly bright, but he's a guy who impressed people like Giscard d'Estaing of France and Chancellor Schmidt of Germany, not only with his understanding of politics, but of international economics. And both of these guys were former finance ministers and pretty tough to impress. But where I think he has not gotten the credit he deserves is in his signing of the 1975 Helsinki Agreement, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And particularly because of the human rights elements of that declaration, because now scholars are beginning to understand that that declaration in 1975 marked really the beginning of the end of the Soviet Empire, because dissidents in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union both used the fact that their governments had pledged to uphold certain standards in human rights in that declaration to organize and to publicize the failure of their governments to pay attention, and the roots of solidarity and of Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia and these other groups whose leaders are now the leaders of those countries, those free and democratic countries, are found in that Helsinki Declaration. Ford knew exactly what he was doing in signing it. Sometimes you do these things and you don't realize the implications,
right.
But as early as 1979, long before any of this was apparent, in his memoirs, Ford wrote that he saw this coming and saw the potential impact of this declaration. And the reality is that he took tremendous heat for it from conservatives and Americans of East European descent who felt that he had essentially signed up to a Yalta II. And the newspapers criticized him for going, they criticized him for signing. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal had an editorial that said, "Jerry, don't go." and his own staff thought he was being suckered by Henry Kissinger into signing this thing. And in reality, it probably cost him the election in 1976, but he thought it was the right thing to do, and it did mark the beginning of the end of the empire.
Bob, did he pardon Nixon in order to keep the United States a stable country throughout the world, or was it just a personal decision, in your opinion?
I worked at the White House at the time. I was on the National Security Council staff, and I always believed that President Ford pardoned Nixon because he felt that after the agony of Vietnam and Watergate, that a trial and keeping this sore open and continuing to have this problem would drain whatever capacity the country had to deal with the international challenges and its problems at home. I'm convinced that, right or wrong, that he did it because he believed it was the best thing for the country, not because it was the best thing for Richard Nixon.
And probably because, what a lot of Americans don't understand is that everybody looks up to America, and if they see the system here wobbly, they get very nervous. I mean, you better than anybody, you get CIA reports on it all the time. And what they want to see is a credible United States. Otherwise, everything starts to shake, and they perceive a weakening. So I guess in the terms of historical strength, I guess he did the right thing for it. And he probably blew the election on that, too. I think that was a big issue at that point.
But the key is that these guys, and it's true of all of them, showed a courage, a political courage, that they almost never got credit for at the time, but is so much clearer in retrospect.
Yeah, well, your book brings that out in a lot of ways. And let's talk about aw shucks Ronald Reagan. Very bright, shrewd guy. He looked like he was a great GE salesman, but he wasn't. He was a pretty shrewd operator, wasn't he?
I think that just as the historian Stephen Ambrose has taken the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower and shown that the sort of image of the grandfatherly, genial old Ike who was manipulated by John Foster Dulles and so on is totally wrong, that Eisenhower really ran that show, that at least in terms of the first term of President Reagan, that future historians will reevaluate him. If you read George Shultz's memoirs, it is clear that all of the critical, key strategic decisions in terms of the Soviet Union, at least, were made by Ronald Reagan, not by people around him, not by Shultz and so on, and that at times Shultz would go too far out on a limb and Reagan would pull him back. At times Cap Weinberger would go too far out and Reagan would pull him back. And here is Reagan, the champion of the defense buildup, of these covert wars across the Third World, challenging the Soviet Union at every turn. But it is Reagan who has the wisdom, once that defense buildup is well underway, who says this isn't an end in itself, it's a means to an end, and the end is a more peaceful world. And now that we've regained our strength, now that we've regained our confidence, now is the time to begin arms control negotiations. Now is the time to begin doing deals with the Soviets. And I cite instances in the book where he will turn to Shultz and say, you can go this far, but not any farther in your negotiations with the Soviets, and then turn to Cap Weinberger and said, but after this meeting, we are going to begin to make concessions.
So he really was a very bright guy. I mean, most people think that he was a congenial type of guy who was programmed by a lot of different people. Your book refutes that totally.
Well, I'm not going to make a case that this was a guy who labored hard in the intellectual vineyard, okay?
But he had good common sense.
And I'm not going to say that this is a guy who had command of a lot of details, a lot of specifics. Certainly not anything of the order on the order of a Jimmy Carter. But the reality is he had a great strategic sense, and he had a strategic vision and a historical optimism that also were combined with a great sense of negotiating timing. And I just think he combined these in a way that allowed the United States, first of all, significantly to increase the pressure on a Soviet Union in crisis, and then take advantage of that crisis to lock in some very significant advantages for the West and for the United States.
So was it instinct or impulse? I mean, I'm sure he wasn't a great reader. I'm sure he was not a great student. But something about him clicked. I mean, he was able to move things.
I think a good part of it was instinct. I think he frankly had a lot of help from Shultz. I say in the book that I think the two of them forged the most productive relationship between a president and a secretary of state since Harry Truman and George Marshall, because Shultz found the specific ways, the specific channels to translate Reagan's strategy and Reagan's vision into concrete policy. And so it was a very productive relationship, it seems to me.
Smart. Tell me about Bill Casey.
Casey was probably the most intellectually lively person I ever worked for. He read more, met with more diverse people of every political stripe, businessmen, wackos, you name it. He would, if you had an idea and you wanted to get in Casey's door, you were in. And he had a better ability than anybody I've ever met to sift through all of the chaff and pick out the one or two kernels of nuggets of information in a conversation that would make it worth his while. Casey came to the agency with a unique objective. He didn't come to run the agency better, to manage it more efficiently, to make CIA a better participant in the policy process, make intelligence more relevant, or any of those things that the rest of us generally did. Casey came to CIA with one objective, and that was to wage war against the Soviet Union. And he was Reagan's instrument in waging that covert conflict around the world. The curious thing about Casey with all these covert actions is that there was only one that got him in trouble. The covert actions in Afghanistan, in Angola, in Cambodia, everywhere around the world were done pretty much by the book, had considerable congressional support, and were really fairly non-controversial. Central America was the problem. And I don't know to this day why Casey became so obsessed with it. I mean, it was a serious problem. There's no question about that. But why he became so zealous about it and was willing to bend the rules in terms of how that conflict was conducted, I really have never understood. I think that the book presents a pretty balanced account of Casey, both in terms of what he brought to the agency, but also the costs that he imposed. And one of the points that I make is that from the day he arrived on the job, Bill Casey was guilty of contempt of Congress, and it manifested
That's a nice
itself.
way to start.
And it manifested itself in every conceivable way. He clearly found stroking those guys, keeping them informed, doing what was his job, which was cooperating with the congressional overseers. He just found that a waste of his time, and his contempt for them was very quickly reciprocated.
That's a great
and in
point.
that respect, he imposed a considerable cost on the agency.
Did you ever hear of the name Amiram Nir?
Yes.
Did you ever hear of the name Kimchi?
Oh, yes.
Did you ever hear of the Iran-Contra affair?
Yeah.
Was Israel involved in this thing or not?
Very much so at the beginning. It was David Kimche, I think, who originally persuaded Bud McFarlane.
He was a former Mossad operator.
That persuaded Bud McFarlane that we could get our hostages out in exchange for selling weapons or allowing Israel to sell weapons to the Iranian government. After the end of 1985, Israel basically dropped out of the picture, and everything that happened after that was done strictly inside the U.S. government. But the origins, the roots of the Iranian arms deal are from Israel. And the interesting thing is, CIA was reporting all through 1985 that there were no moderates in Iran, especially when it came to the United States. But Bud McFarlane chose to believe what he was hearing from Kimche and other Israelis to the contrary, and basically ignored what the CIA analysis was.
So was it a tragedy, the whole thing?
The whole thing was a tragedy. It was a terrible mistake, and a high price was paid.
And did Reagan know or he didn't know? Nobody knows.
Who knows?
Lapse of memories. We'll cut for a commercial break. It's fascinating. You should stay with us. We're going to do a telethon on this book. It's unbelievable. It's called From the Shadows, Robert Gates, one of the most impressive books I've read. So we'll see you right after commercial. We're back. We're here with Robert Gates. He's published From the Shadows. It's a tremendous book. I've been plugging it the whole show, but believe me, you got to buy this book. There's 3 beliefs. That's like Islamic belief. All right, we've covered all the presidents except George Bush, and then we're going to go on to other things like what the CIA is all about, how it operates, how a young man from Indiana gets recruited by the CIA. How does it work? I mean, no one knows much about the CIA. George Bush, you tell me, had the best national security team ever assembled. He had Scowcroft, he had Powell, he had Cheney, Baker, the whole ball of wax. So what went wrong? Why did he lose the election?
I think, I'm no expert on U.S. domestic affairs, but I think the conventional wisdom is I think the conventional wisdom is probably right. He failed to persuade the American people that he could deal as effectively with their domestic problems as he had dealt with the foreign problems. And I think there was a premature sense in 1992 that we didn't have any foreign problems anymore. And maybe we'll talk about that later. But I think that Bush's great strength was I don't think we've ever had a president who was better at hands-on, day-to-day management of foreign policy. And given the period he was president, it was a perfect fit, because he had just one crisis after another cascading on one another, from the revolutions in Eastern Europe to the reunification of Germany to the ending of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And frankly, I believe that Bush's statecraft and his relationships with foreign leaders and the way he managed that whole time made a very unstable revolutionary period seem a lot less dangerous than it really was. When you think that the Soviet Union, that there was no precedent in history for an empire so huge, so old, and so dangerously well-armed to collapse so fast. I mean, the potential for instability and for civil war, for nuclear conflict inside Russia, and so on. People didn't think much about that because it all seemed to flow so smoothly, and I think they don't really appreciate the role that Bush played in helping it go smoothly.
Where were you during the Gulf War?
I was Deputy National Security Advisor.
And was the Gulf War, was it the correct thing to do?
Absolutely. I think that it was the right thing to do to liberate Kuwait, to wreck the offensive arm of the Iraqi army. I think that the other correct thing to do, and I give Jim Baker and the President a huge amount of credit for this, was understanding the value in building a large international coalition to go with us to do the job.
Talking about Jim Baker, in your opinion, you worked for 11 Secretaries of State. Who was the most impressive?
Of those that I worked for, I think that the two, I would choose two. I think Henry Kissinger and George Shultz were probably the two who combined an ability to deal with the day-to-day problems with a strategic vision, a sense of strategic priorities, a geopolitical sense of the world. Of all of them, I think probably Baker was the best negotiator.
We saw him in Madrid. We saw the way he put those people together. And basically the foundation for the peace process today, well, first is Camp David, and second is Madrid. Yes. When he schlepped Shamir to sit at that table. I don't know if you were there, but you surely knew what was happening. And Shamir sat at that table, and we were there, and the Palestinians at that time were taking a direct order from Arafat, and Shamir was playing around with the concept that these were, quote, Jerusalem Israeli Arabs who were sitting at that table, and it was a ploy. I mean, everybody knew it was coming, which brings me to another subject. Mr. Arafat, you think this man is on the road to peace?
I think that there is no example anywhere in the world of the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union that is comparable to the impact in the Middle East. For so many years, the Soviet Union was the chief political supporter, armorer, and cash cow for both the PLO and Syria. And it is not an accident, as the Soviets used to say, that within months of the Soviet collapse, the PLO began making noises about talking to Israel, and that Syria began expressing some. They were later. Assad came later, but he has no alternative. There is no place to go. If 82 Syrian planes get shot down today, they're irreplaceable.
That's right. His Air Force.
Nobody's going to give them to him like the Soviets did. And so these guys, I think, have their sense of self-preservation, their sense of political survival is such that I think it impels them in this direction. And I think that I am very impressed by Arafat's ability in the middle of this difficulty, of this violence in the Middle East right now, his ability to get the Palestinian National Council to rescind the part of their charter that calls for the destruction of Israel.
Did they rescind it, or did they agree to rescind it?
Well, I'm not sure, but to make that political initiative. I spoke to some people yesterday from Likud, mainly people like Benny Begin and big names in the Likud. They said that what he agreed to do was sort of a letter of intent, that he will do it in futuro, but he agreed to do it. So it's a 6-month lapse, because I know there's going to be a big problem with Jerusalem. I mean, he wants to include something in those clauses. Let's go back to the CIA. That's a fascinating topic. Can a president of the United States control the CIA? Well, no, he has to share it with the Congress now. Now, the key is, no, he has to share that control with the Congress. One of the effects of the congressional investigations in 1974-75 was that they discovered that the things that CIA had done that most bothered them had been ordered by the president. CIA was not a rogue elephant operating on its own. It was controlled by the president, and that was the problem. And so what they did was essentially dilute the president's authority over CIA and give Congress a much greater say in how the agency is used. A new oversight process was created that is much more intrusive. I would guess today that the congressional committees know more about the CIA budget than anybody in the executive branch. Certainly was that case when I was director. And so he has to share that control. But the notion of CIA as kind of out of control or some kind of a rogue agency was put to bed in 1976, and if anything, it has gotten more cautious since then.
Is it tough to get new recruits for the CIA today, or
quite the contrary? The last year I was director, CIA had a few hundred openings, and we received over 150,000 applications or inquiries of intent, desire to apply. Statistically, one of my recruiting officers told me, he said statistically it's 20 times harder to get into CIA than to get into Harvard College.
Is that right? Is it the food or the salary?
It's neither, I assure you. It is the challenge, the excitement. One of the things, I always went back to CIA after my assignments at the White House because despite the allure of defense and state and some of the other places, I never found another agency in the government where a young person could rise quickly based solely on performance, and where you could displace a much more senior person if you were better than they were.
Really?
And I always felt that upward mobility, if you will, was much easier in CIA for people who were good than any place else in the government.
So it's meritocracy. I mean, if you deserve it, you rise.
Well, it worked for me, and I saw it work for a lot of people. I wouldn't claim that CIA does not have a lot of bureaucratic aspects, and the book is no sort of self-serving defense of CIA. There's a lot in this book about the CIA's problems and its bureaucracy, and in fact I wrote Casey a memo in 1981 saying the CIA is becoming like the Department of Agriculture. There are too many people here who have lost the spark, who have retired in place. So it has its problems, but certainly more than any other government agency I found at a place where merit was recognized.
Okay, the big question, how did that spy, what's his name?
Aldrich James.
Aldrich James. You write about him in your book?
I do. I first of all, I think people should not have ever been surprised that there was a mole in CIA. I mean, every other American national security organization has been penetrated. The military departments, the National Security Agency, and so on. The real tragedy is that the guy was able to operate in place for so long. And there's been lots of studies, lots of arguments, lots of statistics and things put forward about why it happened, how it happened, and so on. I think it's really fairly simple. I think over the years, culminating in the mid-1980s, there was a hubris, a pride a false pride at CIA that they couldn't be penetrated. They watched all these other agencies and all these other departments deal with penetrations by the Soviets, and since they hadn't found any, and since our counterintelligence operations and our recruits from the KGB couldn't tell us about any agents in CIA, they convinced themselves that there weren't any. There weren't any moles, weren't any penetrations. They also excessively relied on the polygraph. If you passed the polygraph, you were in. They got lazy about counterintelligence. And the combination of that investigative laziness together with the hubris created the conditions in which an Aldrich James, with all of the telltale signs that something was wrong, lasted for as long as he did. But the good news in all of that is that illusion that the agency couldn't be penetrated has been shattered. And now I think they take these things much more seriously.
Compliance.
And they will be much more serious about investigating things as well as using the polygraph.
Do you know anything about this Pollard case, or you don't touch that at all?
Well, I know what the circumstances are.
But that's not your agency. That was
That's right.
Naval. It was Naval Intelligence.
It was Navy.
And do you think that this guy should be paroled after 10 years, or you don't really?
Well, I don't know the specifics of the case, but what I look at is that successive administrations have reviewed it, including the Clinton administration, that looked at it very closely, and the Justice Department, Janet Reno, recommended that they not change the situation.
Noriega, you read about him?
No. The focus of the book is primarily on the U.S.-Soviet relationship during those 5 presidencies, and even the Persian Gulf I deal with only in the context of the Soviet role.
So that'll be your second book.
Yeah.
Go through a bunch of personalities.
I guess so.
How about blacks and women? Are they introduced, or can they be recruited, or are they recruited?
The agency has made tremendous progress in hiring women, but they're really one of the problems that the agency's leaders have to deal with is that there are really 4 cultures in the agency. There's the analytical side, there's the operational side, the scientific and technical side, and the administrative side. The analytical side of the agency made huge progress in hiring women. I would say at the time I was director, half of the new hires in the analytical side of CIA, half or more, were women, and many of the senior officials in the analytical side are women. The operations directorate has had a much worse record, just to take the 2 key parts of the agency. The operations directorate has had a much more difficult time culturally in dealing with A, recruiting women, and B, moving them up the pipeline quickly. It's slowly beginning to happen, but I think they're pretty far behind the power curve. Partly it was I think a paternalistic approach where the people who ran the Directorate of Operations, or the senior officials in it, felt that it was too dangerous to send women into the Middle East, into a lot of third world countries, into the real spy business, which is where careers are made and broken in the clandestine service. And I think only slowly have they come to the realization that in many of these societies, actually a woman case officer can do a lot better than a man, because in some of these male-oriented cultures, they don't pay attention to a woman as much. And so she is able to get into places and listen to conversations and deal with people in a way that a man couldn't. Minorities, particularly black Americans, has been a real problem for the agency. We have worked very hard to try and recruit more blacks, and there are a number of blacks. My executive assistant when I was director was an African-American woman, economist, by the way. But it has been very difficult, and the agency has tried a lot of different methods, including trying to sponsor co-ops as far down as the high school level and college level, to try and help pay for part of their education with the commitment to come to the agency. There has been an improvement, but I don't think it's as great as anybody would like.
Let's talk about the all-star team: Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Primakov. What a team. Gorby, what do you think of him?
I think his tenure as the last Soviet leader is the embodiment of the law of unintended consequences. This is a guy who set out in 1985 to reform Soviet communism and save the Soviet Union, and instead he ended up destroying it. He destroyed the Stalinist structure that sustained it. He destroyed the fear that allowed the Communist Party to maintain its control. I wrote Bush a memo in the summer of 1990 urging him not to, when I was Deputy National Security Advisor, urging him not to rely solely on Gorbachev, because I felt that, I told him in the memo that I thought there was a good chance Gorbachev wouldn't be around a year or two after that because of all the problems that he had. And I wrote at the end of the memo that Gorbachev, and I realize it's a stretched analogy, but I said Gorbachev is like a Soviet Moses. He has delivered the Soviet peoples from the bondage of Stalinism, but he has not the vision to carry them over to the promised land. He didn't understand any kind of economy other than a socialist, communist economy. And he did not understand the terrible weakness of his position because he was the only leader in the Soviet Union in 1990 or 1991 who had not been elected. And he structured the elections in a way that he didn't have to go before the electorate. That was a risk Yeltsin was willing to take and has always been willing to take. So Gorbachev's glory is that he destroyed the Stalinist system. His tragedy is he couldn't build something to take its place. And that's why the Soviet Union collapsed.
And Yeltsin?
Yeltsin is not a president in the sense that we understand a president. He doesn't care anything about day-to-day administration of the government. He kind of doesn't pay attention. He disappears for days at a time. He is, shall we say, inattentive to detail. But the fact is that he is, however he has slowed down the process of reform, however he has conducted the war in Chechnya, many other problems. They're not fulfilling their obligations under arms control agreements. There are a lot of problems that we have with the Russians, but the reality is, given a choice between Yeltsin and the communist Zhuganov, reform will at least stay alive under Yeltsin. It won't go very far, but it won't die and it won't be reversed. Under the communists, if the communists come back under Zhuganov, I believe it'll be reversed. Not to create a Soviet Union that was the kind of threat that the old Soviet Union was, but one that will be a much more difficult problem for the United States and other nations to manage. My own view is Yeltsin's going to win the election. It'll probably be a narrow victory, but I think we have seen since 1990 that every time the Russians went to the polls, this country that hasn't had a democratic life in its 1,000-year history has embraced democracy. And every election since 1989, 1990, the Russians have tended to vote their hopes rather than their fears. And I think that's going to happen again.
Is he a thinker, though, Yeltsin?
No, I don't think so.
Not
I think I had a secret meeting with Foreign Minister Primakov when he was head of the KGB. With his predecessor, Khrushchev, the head of the KGB, at a restaurant in Washington during one of the summits. Nobody knew what was going on. It was the highest level CIA KGB summit in history. And we were talking about Yeltsin. And Khrushchev leaned across the table to me over his Chivas Regal, and he said, Yeltsin, I hope you don't think he's a Democrat. Yeltsin is a leader of...
But if he was drinking Stolichnaya, you might have heard something else, right?
Yeltsin is an authoritarian leader who has enough confidence in himself to run for election. And then he kind of backs off. He's kind of almost thinks of himself as a figurehead, not like we think of a president.
Not hands-on.
And that's why he really doesn't get things accomplished. He doesn't create a political faction in the parliament to support him. He just doesn't do a lot of the things that he ought to try and strengthen democracy in his own program.
I think you're right. I was in Russia with President Clinton on the last trip, not this one, the one before that, when I had these big parades for the 50th anniversary. And what we did is we went behind the scenes to film the other parade, and everybody was marching with Stalin placards, and everybody was marching with Lenin placards. Everybody wanted to go back to the old system because you have people over 50 or 60, that's all they knew. It was their religion. I mean, they wanted to go to the tomb.
And they're suffering the most.
Right, and they are suffering. So there's this tremendous wedge between this nouveau riche wealthy and this tremendous poor. And I don't know where that winds up. And if Yeltsin's not paying attention, he may win again. But, he switches governments like I switch baseball teams, He just flies around with these guys. And Primakov's a hard-line guy. He's taken different positions than his other foreign ministers. So I think it's unknown what's going to happen in Russia. I mean, basically, it's nearly a third-world country in terms of its economics. The development there is terrible, Bob.
Look, the governments of both the United States and Russia, I think, give a misleading picture. I mean, they look at the macroeconomics. They have brought the inflation rate down. They have stabilized the ruble. Some important things have been done in privatization. But you get beneath that, and it's a mess. The living conditions for most Russians are terrible. This is a country where the GNP has fallen between a third and a half in the last 5 years. It's a country with 15% real unemployment, where they've known no unemployment for 3 generations. It's a country where the healthcare system has collapsed. Just give you one example. The explosion of disease in Russia, diphtheria, cholera, tuberculosis, dysentery. There were 2,000 cases of diphtheria in Russia in 1990. There were 200,000 cases in 1994. This is a country where a lot of people are hurting.
The medical system is terrible. I mean, you're right, and people don't understand that. We saw it, and it was terrible. And I saw it in Ukraine also. I mean, a college professor makes $30 a month in Ukraine.
Well, and the other side of it is, judging from comments and reports by the Russian Ministry of Foreign External Trade, the Russian Central Bank, and Interpol, 40% of the Russian economy is controlled by organized crime at this point.
I know, it's terrible. Bob, we're going to run out of time. Did you have to get clearance from the CIA to write this book?
I did, but times have changed. I changed some of the rules when I was director. I ordered the declassification of all of the estimates on the Soviet Union up to 1983, and a part of the new process of openness in the agency. And I was very comfortable with the review process. They took out very little.
Great. By the way, how's the Mossad doing? Are they good?
I think they're good.
Our people here are very interested in the Mossad. Thank you very much for coming on. If you get a chance, come back this way. I know you live in Washington. Maybe we'll fly to you, but we'd love to have you again. It's a great book, From the Shadows. It took me all night, and I read it, and I told you before, I'm leery and weary, but it was worth it.